In the world of One Piece, there's obvious references to real-world piracy. That includes things like Jolly Rogers, treasure maps, and of course the names of famous pirates. In this video, I want to focus on a detail you may or may not be aware of. Going back to the Long Ring Longland arc, there's a bit of a throwaway conversation between Chopper and Robin in chapter 306. In this chapter, we get our first ever mention of Davy Jones in the series, since the Davy Back fight the challenge Foxy proposed is named after him. Chopper asks Robin who Davy Jones is, and she says, a pirate from long ago who was cursed by a demon and is said to live deep down on the seafloor. He lives on the seafloor? That's the legend. Any sunken ships or treasure get locked away in Davy Jones' locker. Davy keeps everything that sinks down to him, so pirates refer to taking what you want from your enemies as Davy Back. Now looking back at everything we've seen so far in One Piece, these 3 forgettable panels haven't really contributed to the overall narrative or world. Yeah, it's cool to know that Davy Jones exists in One Piece's world, but as far as we know, we could have gone without knowing this as it doesn't connect with anything else in the story yet. But if you're an avid One Piece enthusiast, you know that Oda doesn't just throw in random details that have no purpose. If there's a small throwaway piece of information that Oda decides to insert into the story, it doesn't matter if it seems to not have any meaning in the moment. No matter how long it takes, it will have a payoff. It could come a few chapters later, dozens of chapters later, or even hundreds. And I believe this is the case with the mention of Davy Jones and the bit of lore we get about him as well. So what could possibly be the importance of these obscure bits of dialogue? Well, I want to take some time to break down what's happening here. Before I get into the dialogue itself, I want to take a look at specifically who speaks about Davy Jones. Oda writes with insane attention to detail, so I think it's safe to assume that he's deliberate even when choosing who speaks about certain things. After all, Sanji was the only one in the Straw Hats who spoke about the story of Noland since he came from the North Blue, and even that small detail had purpose as it came full circle much later in the Whole Cake Island arc when Sanji's backstory was revealed. But going back to Davy Jones, we can say for sure that both Robin and Sanji knew about him as they were the only 2 who spoke about him. Yeah, the Foxy Pirates mentioned him by name. Whether they know what they're talking about or not is a different matter altogether, but regardless it makes sense since that's literally their whole shtick. They go around stealing crewmates from other crews using the Davy Back fight. And yes, I know Usopp is also aware of what the Davy Back fight is, but that doesn't necessarily equate to knowing the legend that inspired its name. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, we can't say for sure. The only ones we can definitively say know about Davy Jones are Robin and Sanji. Now perhaps there's something more to this, but I think Robin knowing about Davy Jones is apt considering she generally just knows a lot, especially about history. Now Sanji's the interesting one. The most likely reason for him knowing is that the Davy Jones story was also popular in the North Blue, just like the Noland story. And knowing that Noland is from the North Blue, and also that Oda has been known to use parallels throughout the story, I would say that maybe Davy Jones has some sort of connection to the North Blue. Not saying he was born there or that he formed his crew there, I just think at some point something went down somewhere in the North Blue and that Davy Jones was involved. It could be anything. After all, this is One Piece, the possibilities are endless. But taking a look at this first line, it says, a pirate from long ago who was cursed by a demon and is said to live deep down on the seafloor. From long ago, the first thing that comes to mind is the Void Century. Now you might be thinking, if he's from the Void Century, how do people know about him in the current era? Well, the world government only erased knowledge that would pose a threat to them, not everything that happened during that time. But unfortunately, there's no way to pinpoint when in history Davy Jones was prevalent, but I just like the idea that it was during the Void Century as a way of giving the legend more mystique. Robin also says he was cursed by a demon and is said to live deep down on the sea floor. This sounds exactly like a devil fruit user who has sunk to the bottom of the ocean, but it specifically said that he lives despite being deep underwater, and the only way that could be possible is if he's a fish man. We've seen this before with Jack, who's a devil fruit user, so naturally he sunk to the bottom of the ocean, but he's still able to breathe because he's a fish man. And now I want to address this sketch Oda drew of Davy Jones, and how people will say he looks nothing like a fish man. Going back to Jack again, if it wasn't for his teeth, we would have no physical indication that he's a fish man. In this picture, not only does it lack detail, but we're literally missing the whole lower half of his body. For all we know, he could have octopus tentacles like Hyozo from Fishman Island. And all of this is considering that this sketch should even be taken seriously. For the sake of the video, I will, but just keep in mind, all it seems to be, at least for now, is a fun little sketch Oda quickly drew up as a sort of companion piece to an answer he gave to a fan question. And he's known to do this. This isn't a one-off or anything out of the ordinary. For those of you that still aren't convinced that he's a fish man, I have one last detail to share, but just keep in mind how I talked about Oda being deliberate with his writing. In the entire series, there's only one other connection to Davy Jones' name aside from the Davy Back fight, and that is the name of the main antagonist of Fishman Island, Bodie Jones, and I'm willing to bet that he's the direct descendant of Davy Jones. Also, I want to mention how it's implied that Davy Jones is actually still alive. Robin says live as in present tense, and unless it's some sort of weird translation error, I think it's supposed to be taken literally. So how is a pirate from long ago still alive today? Well, of course we know that people can live pretty long as seen with Dr. Kureha, and it's also subjective as to how long ago is. But in the context of One Piece and how grand the history of its world has been built up to be, I personally feel like long ago is closer to 1,000 years if not more, and that pretty much lines up with the Void Century. With that being said, the two possibilities I've come up with are that his devil fruit has extended his lifespan tremendously, or that a user of the Ope Ope no Mi used the perpetual youth surgery on him. The important thing to note here is that immortality is possible in the world of One Piece, so as long as it's a real possibility, regardless of the method, it makes Davy Jones' considerably long lifespan feasible. Now in regards to the rest of the dialogue here, there's not really anything else to dig into. It all seems in line with what we understand about Davy Jones, with him keeping the treasure to himself and the naming of the Davy Back fight. So all that's left to do is to take a look at everything we've established and put it all together. The way I'm going to go about this is to review the points that I think are possible but are still kind of uncertain, and then follow up with the ones that I think are most likely going to be true if Davy Jones ever does get officially introduced into the series. The connection to North Blue I'm still unsure about, since I only have one reason for thinking this, which is just that Sanji was talking about him. He lived during the Void Century, again because I think it would make things more interesting. And lastly, that through devil fruit abilities, whether it's his own or someone else's, he was enabled to live much longer. We still have so much left of One Piece that we can't ignore the possibility of more methods of extending one's lifespan or attaining immortality being introduced in the future. Moving on to the likely details, he was a devil fruit user because he was cursed and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. He's a fish man, that's how he was able to live underwater. He's the ancestor of Hody Jones, and of course he's still alive because Robin said he was. But there's one last thing I'm going to show before bringing this all together. In the SBS section of volume 38, Oda outlines what he thinks is the general depiction of Davy Jones in the real world, and I think this is important as Oda tends to take inspiration from many sources, real world and fictional. The Davy Jones locker that Robin mentions in volume 33 is a well-known legend among sailors in real life. There are several different accounts, but in general there was a lying no good pirate named Davy Jones, a greedy deck chief who was famous for putting all the crew's valuables in his own locker. He was so wicked, even for a pirate, that one day the devil himself cursed Davy to live at the bottom of the sea forever, swapping the deck of a sunken ship and placing all the sunken treasure into his locker, where it would never be seen again. While I'm sure Oda's Davy Jones would certainly take inspiration from this, it wouldn't be copy and paste. He would obviously do his own spin on it, but at the very least he would incorporate some of the elements that he described here. So that's something I'm going to keep in mind along with the rest of the details that I previously mentioned. But with that said, I'm going to try my best to tie this all together and tell what I think is the story of Davy Jones in the world of One Piece. Davy Jones was a greedy pirate who lived during the Void Century. During his time as a pirate, he became infamous for stealing and looting from innocents and fellow pirates alike. His thievery spared no one, not even his own kind. This caused fishermen to outcast him as they felt he couldn't be trusted. He traveled to many places including the North Blue, one of the places where his infamy was particularly felt by its inhabitants, causing him to be well known in the region. One day, Davy caught wind of a great treasure hidden within the ancient kingdom. He knew that to make this treasure his own, he would have to gain the favor of the people who resided in this kingdom, and so he did. He introduced himself amicably to these people and swore loyalty to their kingdom. After years of gaining their trust, he had finally located where they kept their treasure. But this wasn't the great treasure that he sought. What he was searching for was located in the most heavily guarded area in the entire kingdom. And after much time planning as to how he could steal that particular treasure, he managed to get to it. This is what he had heard about years ago. Strange looking fruits that varied in color, shape, and pattern, but could grant a unique and powerful ability to whoever eats one. There were many of them, however he could only get his hands on one before being caught in the act. He began to make his escape, but was eventually cornered. He knew he wasn't strong enough to fight his way through, so he only had one option left, and that was to eat the fruit and use the ability to forcefully make a path to his ship. He hadn't planned on eating it, but rather to sell it, as he cared more about money than power. Davy finally made it to his ship and started to sail off with all the treasure, but the people of the kingdom would fire at his ship until it began to sink. He was upset that he would lose the treasure as his ship sank, but at least he could still escape by quickly swimming away due to his fishman ancestry, or so he thought. To his surprise, he began to sink as well because of the fruit's properties. Soon he'd find himself at the very bottom of the ocean, and it turns out that the fruit also seemed to give him eternal life. So there Davy Jones would lie, with nothing but treasure and the remains of his ship around him, forced to live eternally in solitude. That was the price he paid for his avarice. However, he would not be forgotten. Some people in the kingdom knew what the ability of the devil fruit Davy ate was, and of course that he was a fishman, so they assumed what his fate would be, and they were right. Word of what happened would eventually spread far beyond the ancient kingdom, to many places including the North Blue, where the people rejoiced as they felt Davy Jones had finally gotten the retribution he deserved. His story would be passed down through generations, serving as a cautionary tale of the consequences greed and lies would bring. Before I wrap this up, I'm going to address a few things. I incorporated the Ancient Kingdom into the story because there's many people who speculate that this was the place where devil fruits originated, and I like this idea. It lines up with a time period as the story took place during the Void Century. It also explains why Davy wasn't aware of the downside of losing the ability to swim, since devil fruits were a relatively new thing and most people didn't know much about them, if at all. And yes, I believe it's entirely possible to know about the ability aspect of devil fruits, but not know about the sinking like a hammer part, as I feel like the former would be much more apparent. Lastly, I want to highlight the similarities between the Davy Jones I just described and Buggy. Of course, we know they're both greedy pirates who seem to value treasure and riches above all else, but the story I just told is actually quite similar to the story of how Buggy became a devil fruit user in chapter 19. Buggy finds a treasure map that leads to a treasure on the ocean floor and decides to keep it to himself. Then Shanks tells him that their crew found a devil fruit and that it could sell for 100 million berries. This of course piques Buggy's interest, so he decides to fool the crew into thinking that he ate it, but instead he eats a decoy fruit that he switched out for the real thing. Now he plans to abandon the crew to sell the fruit and to find the treasure so he can be rich and gather his own crew so he can steal even more treasure. Shanks startles Buggy and he hides the fruit in his mouth, just for Shanks to startle him again, causing Buggy to accidentally swallow the fruit. This causes him to also let go of the map and it starts to fall into the ocean. Buggy jumps after it and realizes he can no longer swim as he sinks like a hammer. So in one fell swoop, he loses the fruit and his ability to find the sunken treasure, all because he was too greedy. Of course, it's not the exact same, but there are certainly some parallels you can draw, like how they both revolve around a devil fruit, treasure that has ended up on the sea floor, and greed being their downfalls. And keeping in mind how many parallels are in One Piece, this Davy Jones story would be no exception. But with all that being said, we've come to the end of the video. I had a ton of fun putting this together and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. More One Piece videos and theories coming soon. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Peace.